I'm now going to call on Adrian Shubert from the Department of History at York University. Adrian is a specialist on 19th and 20th century Spain. His work on that subject has developed a new paradigm for understanding Spain, has shifted understanding of that country as a place of decline and failure through that period to one that participated in a broader European pattern of historical development. So Adrian, please.
Thank you, Graham. Although every time I read the newspaper lately, I'm thinking of revising that interpretation as the failure seems ever more evident. So as Graham said, I'm a historian of 19th and 20th century Europe, primarily Spain. Modern Europe is a large historical field, but very few people within it are drawn to the study of Spain. Despite having been Europe's most powerful state for almost 2 centuries and the center of a truly global empire for 3, by the end of the French Revolution, which marks the beginning of Europe's modern history, Spain's influence was much reduced. A second-tier diplomatic and military power, a slow industrializer, and in some eyes at least, not the source of significant cultural creation, historians have seen Spain as marginal to the main plot lines of Europe's modern period, which are dominated by Britain, Germany, France, and to a lesser extent, Russia. Much of my work has sought to challenge that view, to reassess Spain's place in European history, and to make European history more expansive. 3 reasons led me to devote my research to Spain. The most important was the impact made by William Callahan, a truly wonderful professor who taught me as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. Second, as I ended my undergraduate career and thought about doing graduate work, I realized that Spain was a field much less tilled than the history of Britain, France, or Germany, and that there was more opportunity to take on big questions. Finally, I'd already studied Spanish and had a reasonably good working knowledge of the language. The decision to do Spanish history then was a conscious one. The path which my research has actually taken has been determined much more by serendipity, that's a word that seems to repeat itself, than by planning. The topic for my first book, which came out of my thesis, was the labor movement amongst the coal miners of Asturias in northern Spain, from the beginnings of the modern mining industry in the 1860s to the miners' revolution of 1934. My supervisor, Paul Preston, suggested this after the topic I'd started with turned out to be a dead end. However, what Paul had in mind was an institutional and political history. What I produced was a social history that explored the changing ways of work, of family and social life, of residence and sociability as a way of explaining miners' behavior. This was 1978. At the very beginning of the post-Franco years in Spain, and Spanish archives, especially those for the recent period, were hard to access and difficult to use where they existed at all. The best parts of my book were based on two sets of documents I discovered with the help of an employee of the state coal mining company. One strewn on the floor of a small room next to the local jail in the damp basement of a town hall. The other in the attic of the former head office of one of the predecessor mining companies, behind flimsy wooden doors to which no one had a key and which had to be broken down so I could get in. Well, not exactly Indiana Jones, but for a historian, that's really exciting. My next project was very different, and perhaps a risky one for a new PhD in the atrocious job market of the early 1980s, a synthesis of the social history of modern Spain. This has turned out to be my most important scholarly book. I brought together most of the literature in a still undeveloped field to make a novel argument about Spain's place in broader history of Europe. At a time when historians working under the shadows cast by the Spanish Civil War and the lengthy Franco dictatorship saw the country's history as a failure to follow the desired European road, argued that Spain's history was fully part of the European mainstream. My timing was perfect. The book was published at a moment when things in Spain were going well, and historians there were much more open to an optimistic reading of their country's history. The idea for my third book came out of the previous one. While doing the section on urbanization and new forms of leisure in the 19th century, I knew, this being a book about Spain, I had to include at least a brief discussion of bullfighting. And in doing the reading for this, I discovered, much to my surprise, that there was no serious historical study of this important institution. This was the project that's been most fun to do. It certainly provoked many discussions, often incredulous amongst my colleagues. It was also the first time that I had to deal with an abundance rather than a scarcity of sources. The result was Death and Money in the Afternoon, A History of the Spanish Bullfight. The title of the US edition was not my first choice. My preferred title, and the one the Spanish publisher kept, at 5 in the afternoon, quotes from a poem by Federico Garcia Lorca. Late in the day, the US publisher asked for something less obscure, and preferably which gave a nod to Ernest Hemingway, since the book was going to appear during the centenary of his birth, a coincidence of which I was happily oblivious. This book, too, made a contrarian argument. Rather than a barbaric holdover and the indicator of some sort of essential Spanishness, the bullfight was fully modern. One example, indeed one of the pioneers, of the commercialization of mass leisure that became such a characteristic feature of modern European and North American society starting in the late 19th century. The book was reviewed, amongst other places, in the Globe and Mail sports section. My next project was something very different again, and entirely the product of circumstance. The government of Ontario had decided to eliminate grade 13. We had always had one more year of high school in Ontario, and create a new 4-year curriculum. Grade 12 was going to have a new history course called The West and the World Since 1500. My colleague Arthur Haberman, who had written a text for the previous grade 13 course, which was solely about Europe, had been asked by his publisher to produce a new one for the new course. Arthur invited me to join him on this project, and I agreed immediately. This was a new challenge, to synthesize 5 centuries of world history and to present it in a way that senior high school students can understand. And I believe we met it. We were also able, I think, to escape a Eurocentric perspective and to incorporate some of the approaches of what was then the emerging field of transnational and world history, as well as to incorporate some of the cutting-edge work being done by York colleagues such as the late Eleanor Melville, the inventor of Latin American environmental history. And this is the book of which I am proudest. In retrospect, there's been a pattern to my work. A rough alternation between monographic studies based on deep archival research, which is the historian's basic task, and synthetic works aimed at a broader, non-academic audience, something which I believe is amongst the historian's obligations and something to which Tim referred earlier. My current project continues the pattern. It is a biography of Baldomero Espartero, a name I know will resonate with none of you, but a man who was one of the key political and military figures of 19th century Spain. It will benefit from my unique access to his private papers, which fill 32 CD-ROMs. Biography is a new departure for me, one which presents its own unique challenges. At the same time, its immense popularity as a genre offers the possibility of bringing the two sides of my work together in an archive-based study that reaches a broad readership. Thank you.